An abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town had long terrified the locals. A place where, according to rumors, horrifying experiments were conducted had been empty for many years, though no one knew exactly what happened. People preferred not to remember it, and those who dared to come close spoke of strange sounds and odd shadows flickering in the window openings. Mark, a young journalist with a tendency to explore mysterious places, arrived in town to write an article about urban legends. After hearing about the hospital, he couldn't resist the temptation and decided to go there, despite the warnings from the locals. He had always been drawn to stories about cursed places and missing people, and this hospital seemed the perfect subject for his next report. At first glance, the building didn't seem that scary. An old, dilapidated structure, overgrown with ivy and almost swallowed by nature, stood deep in the woods, hidden from prying eyes. But the closer Mark got, the stronger his sense of discomfort became. The air felt heavy, as if the place itself was repelling unwanted visitors. Upon entering the building, Mark immediately felt the cold radiating from the walls. Though it was summer outside, inside the hospital reigned a stifling chill. The floors were covered in a thick layer of dust, but despite years of neglect, the furniture and equipment remained nearly untouched. Everything looked as though people had simply disappeared all at once, leaving behind belongings they hadn't had time to take. Mark took out his camera and began taking pictures as he walked past old wards, operating rooms, and offices. At first, everything was as usual. He examined the premises, photographed them, and recorded his thoughts on a voice recorder. But then he started noticing oddities. At first, it was barely perceptible shadows, which he dismissed as tricks of the light. But then he saw one of the doors, which he had just checked, close on its own with a light creak. Convincing himself that it was just the wind or his imagination playing tricks, Mark decided to continue his exploration. But the strange sounds didn't stop. Rustling, light footsteps, as if someone was moving through the corridors behind him, though as far as he knew, there was no one in the building but him. The deeper he ventured into the hospital, the stronger the feeling grew that he was being watched. He couldn't shake the sense that someone was lurking around every corner, yet every time he turned, there was no one there. In one of the old offices, he found a folder of medical records, covered in a thick layer of dust. Opening it, Mark came across records of patients who had once been treated in the hospital. His attention was drawn to a name, Lena Voronina. Her case file was full of oddities. Her diagnoses kept changing, and in the final entries, it was noted that she had strange visions and hallucinations before mysteriously disappearing. As he read further, Mark stumbled upon descriptions of experiments conducted on the patients. The doctors had tried to treat them not only with traditional methods but also with psychotropic drugs, which caused horrifying visions in the patients. Judging by the records, Lena was one of those who had undergone the most frightening and prolonged courses of treatment. It was at this moment that Mark realized this hospital had not merely been a place for treating mental illness. Horrible experiments had been conducted here, which by all appearances had spiraled out of control. But what had happened to the patients? Why had the hospital been shut down so suddenly? No one had any answers. The feeling of danger grew. Every new step through the hospital's corridors seemed increasingly perilous. The shadows he had seen earlier became clearer, as though they were moving on their own, without the aid of light. At one point, he noticed one of them approaching him too quickly. The shadow had human outlines, but its face was blurred, and its movements were unnaturally sharp. Mark ran. The corridors he had previously walked through began to shift, as if the building itself didn't want to let him leave. In panic, he stumbled into doors that wouldn't budge, staircases leading nowhere. The hospital turned into a true nightmare maze from which there was no escape. At one turn, he saw an old staircase leading down into the basement. Fleeing from the shadows chasing him, Mark rushed down the steps, not knowing that what awaited him below was not salvation, but his most terrifying ordeal. The basement turned out to be vast and far older than the building itself. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the floor was littered with scattered bodies, remnants of those who had also tried to escape. Here, time stopped. The basement was enveloped in absolute silence, broken only by the echo of his footsteps. Mark tried to understand where he was, but each step took him further into the depths, where the walls began to narrow and the air filled with the strange stench of decay and death. He realized that he had fallen into a trap from which there was no escape. Suddenly he heard a voice. It was a whisper, barely audible but calling his name. He couldn't figure out where the voice was coming from, but it seemed to surround him from all sides. The voice belonged to Lena, the patient whose records he had found earlier. She was pleading for help, but her words were distorted by some inhuman horror. On the verge of madness, Mark tried to find his way back, but each new turn of the basement led him deeper into the darkness. The walls began to move, as if alive, closing in around him. It felt as though the hospital was alive and wouldn't let him leave. The shadows that had been following him now encircled him in a tight ring. When he finally stopped, realizing that there was no way back, a figure appeared before him. It was Lena, but not the one in the photographs. Her face was twisted into a horrific grimace of pain, and her eyes were empty, filled with despair. She reached out her hand to him, and in that moment, Mark understood that he too would become part of this place. In the final instant, before the darkness consumed him completely, he realized that no one would ever leave this hospital alive.